Well, this is a phenomenon called one's chronotype. Um, and I like the old classification, which is, larks, which is about 10% of the population, owls, maybe about 25% of the population, and the rest of us are doves right in the middle. You'll find lots of other terms like dolphins and lions. And I think these actually are not very helpful, but in fact, somewhat misleading. But what it essentially means is your preference for your sleep wake cycle. And so for an owl, you would be going to bed between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning. It can be that late. But if you're a lark, you could be going to bed at 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock in the evening. Now, the really fascinating thing is, well, what makes us a lark or an owl? And there are three, maybe four important factors. One is genetics. So we now know that certain changes or polymorphisms in the genes that underpin the biological clock can nudge you earlier or later in time. So genetics is one factor. And as somebody once said, by their contribution to our genes, our parents are still telling us what time to go to bed and get up. I really like that. The second is how old you are. So from about the age of 10, as we age, we tend to want to go to bed later and later. And for males, they peak in their lateness around about 21, 21 and a half. For females, about 19, 19 and a half. So women tend to peak earlier than men, and they're never quite as late as men. But from the late teens to the early 20s, there's a very, very slow movement to want to go to bed earlier and earlier. So the key point is by the time you're in your sort of late 50s, 60s, you're getting up and going to bed on average about 2 hours earlier than you did when you were in your late teens, early 20s. And I think many people, comment on this that, oh, I find myself feeling sleepier much earlier than I did when I was much younger. So you've got genetics and you've got age. And what's underpinning that change with age is probably the sex steroids. So from about 10 to the late teens, early 20s, there's a huge change in those hormones, testosterone in men, progesterone, estrogen in women, and then a slow change, a decline in those hormones as we age. And that seems to be, it's not exclusively, but that seems to be the dominant issue that's changing our chronotype as we age. And we do know from animal studies that the sex steroids, particularly estrogen and progesterone in females, will have a big influence of sleep-wake timing. And the third factor is when we see light. So morning light advances the body clock. We get up earlier and go to bed earlier, whereas dusk light delays the clock. We go to bed later and get up later. And this is something we can have some control over. A study that we did a few years ago on university students all over the world showed that the later the chronotype, the more owl-like an individual was. The less morning light they got, which would advance the clock, make them get up earlier, but they were getting that late afternoon dusk light, which was shifting the clock later. So if you happen to be a late type and you want to get up earlier, then it's brutal, but it works, that you set the alarm clock, you get a good exposure to light, either by going outside, but of course you may need to use a light box as well, and then that will advance the clock. And you need to do this every day to keep it on track. But that's a key point. It's when we see light.